Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation to you today. As you may know, in 2017, I published a book called The Color of Law. Its purpose was to demolish the myth of de facto segregation, something we all think we know, a term we all use, a term I always used. The idea that the reason we're so residentially segregated in this country, most areas either being predominantly white, predominantly black. The reason we're so segregated is because of private activity. That's what de facto segregation describes. Bigoted white homeowners or landlords refusing to sell or rent to African American buyers or renters, or private businesses, banks, realtors, developers, insurance companies, discriminating on how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe it's only because of income differences, economic differences. African Americans, for the most part, have lower incomes than whites, and so can't afford to live in middle-class white neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted actions, private sector actions are what's created segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. There was no intentionality on the part of government in creating the segregation. It's de facto. Well, what I wrote in The Color of Law is not a hidden history, but a forgotten history of how the segregated nature of American society was explicitly created with racial intent by federal, state, and local governments, with policies so powerful in the 20th century that they still determine not only the racial landscape, but the overall racial inequality of this country today. Our racial segregation is an unconstitutional system. It's an unlawful system. It was implemented by the federal government primarily and by other governments on a racially explicit basis in violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And as such, we have an obligation to remedy it. Well, let me just begin by describing one of the most powerful policies that the federal government implemented in order to create the segregation with which we're all familiar. In the immediate post-World War II period, two federal agencies, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, implemented a program to move the entire white working class and middle class populations out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs from which African Americans would be prohibited from living. At the time, we were a manufacturing economy. We were making things. Most employment was either in factories or in factory-related services like banks. The people who worked in these places, factories, banks, insurance companies, had to live in the urban areas where the factories were located because the factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals so they could get their parts and ship their final products. So in the early 20th century, we had both blacks and whites living in urban areas, working in factories that were also located in those urban areas. I'm not suggesting that it was a fully integrated situation, although there were many integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas then than there are today, many more than there are today. But the federal government decided it was going to move the whites out of those urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. It was a racially explicit program. In my book, The Color of Law, I use as its example Levittown, a place which I imagine many of you familiar, a giant subdivision east of New York City, probably the largest one that was built in that post-World War II period. 17,000 homes in one place. As I said, we weren't a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs prior to this federal program was the very affluent. The federal government, though, decided to move the non-affluent whites to these suburbs. William Levitt, the builder of this project, could never have assembled the capital to construct this project, to buy the land for it. No bank would lend it to him. They thought it was a crazy idea. Who was going to want to live in these suburbs? The only way that Levitt could assemble the capital to buy the land and build these homes was to go to the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations that worked collaboratively, submit his plans for the project, the construction materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, the architectural design of the homes, and a required commitment by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration that he would never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required that Levitt place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA or VA. It was a racially explicit program written out in the housing manual of the Federal Housing Administration, a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend the projects that were requesting federal bank guarantees. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer's proposal to build a project that would sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a project that was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. This is an unconstitutional system of segregation that we have in this country, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. Well, those homes in Levittown, and I just use that as one example, they're in every metropolitan area of this country, throughout the country, in New England, in the Midwest, in the South, and the West, everywhere. These subdivisions sprung up, suburbanizing the white population of the country. The homes at the time were inexpensive, designed for returning war veterans, for working class, middle class families. They sold at the time for about $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Anybody with a job in the post-war boom, and both blacks and whites had those jobs, returning war veterans, could afford a home for $100,000. For veterans, no down payment was required. Low Federal Housing Administration interest rates on their mortgages. Anybody could afford that kind of home, but only whites were permitted. African Americans were prohibited. Now, the whites who bought those homes were looking for a place to live. We had a housing shortage. They didn't expect to get rich by buying one of these very inexpensive homes. But what happened in the next couple of generations is those homes appreciated in value. And you cannot buy a home today, not in Levittown, not in any other suburb of this country, for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained, over the next couple of generations, wealth from the equity appreciation of their homes, the inexpensive homes that they bought. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used to take care of perhaps temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment or a medical issue. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And most importantly, they used that wealth to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that generated wealth. The result is today, African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that, many federally, racially explicit policies, but their income ratio is about 60%. You would think that if the income ratio is 60%, African American household wealth would also be on average about 60% of white household wealth. But in reality, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that has never been remedied. And if we take our constitutional obligation seriously, that we have an obligation to remedy, because it underlies the racial inequality that exists in this country today. That wealth gap not only perpetuates racial segregation and locks African Americans into poorly resourced urban neighborhoods, but it underlies much of the other inequality: less access to health, less access to transportation and good jobs. All of this is a residue and a continuing impact of federal policy. And that's just one policy. I have the color of law describes policy after policy, followed by the federal government and state and local governments as well, to impose segregation on an unconstitutional basis on the African American population. I don't have time to go into many of these other policies now. As I say, they are documented in the color of law. Well, readers of that book, and there were many. The book sold 1 million copies, as well as people who attended lectures like this that I gave, had a similar question after reading it or after hearing me speak. And that question was, what can we do about it now? We know this history now. We know it's an unconstitutional, unlawful system of segregation. What can we do to fix it? Well, I'm an old man. I wanted to retire, but I figured I had to write another book to answer this question. So I recruited my daughter, Leah Rothstein, who knows more about current housing policy than I do. I was a historian, a journalist. I recruited her to co-author a new book called Just Action. And this new book, Just Action, describes what can be done in a local community level, in every community in this country, to redress racial segregation. Our assumption in writing this book, Just Action, is that there is no political will today in this country to enact a national policy that's going to combat the racial inequality that we created. We, our country, our government created. But once you create a system of segregation, once you place two races in two different places, there are many, many local policies that may not have created the segregation, but that sustain and reinforce it. And local organizers, local committees, local activists can take concrete steps to create the pressure needed to redress segregation at a local level, step by step, maybe in small ways at first, but that accumulate to a real impact and perhaps a national movement to finally confront our unconstitutional legacy of apartheid. So let me, in the few minutes I have left with you, describe just a few of the policies that Just Action recounts and recommends that you as citizens, not just as students, but as citizens, can take steps to implement. Well, I mentioned before that once you have two unequal populations, you can have policies that are not racially explicit, but that reinforce their inequality. One is our property tax system. You may not realize it, but African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate relative to the value of their homes than white homeowners do. There are many reasons for this, but perhaps one of the more important ones is that white neighborhoods appreciate in value faster than black neighborhoods do, for a variety of reasons. Most cities and counties don't reassess properties every year. In some cases, they wait 10 years, 15 years to reassess properties. The result is that the tax rate that African Americans pay is higher than the tax rate that whites pay relative to the value of their homes, because as the property values in white neighborhoods increase faster, the assessed value of those homes is farther below their real market value than the assessed value in black homes relative to their real market value in black neighborhoods. The result is that African Americans are paying a tax based on their assessed value that's closer to the real market value of their homes than the rate that whites are paying on their assessed value, which is far below or farther below the market value of their homes. That's just one example. Now, that's not a federal policy. The inequality in neighborhoods was created by the federal government in policies that I described before. But property tax assessments are a purely local issue. It has nothing to do with the federal government. And if we're going to redress that, we need to do it at the local level. The existence of this discriminatory property tax system is not a mystery. Property tax assessors know it. They just don't have an obligation to fix it unless somebody forces them to do so. And that's what a local group can do. Another example of a race-neutral on its face policy that discriminates against African Americans because of the inequality that already exists. And that's our credit scoring system. As you know, if you buy a home and want a mortgage, what you need to do in order to get a bank or a credit union or other financial institution to issue a mortgage is show that you have paid past loans on time. You have to demonstrate that if you had, for example, a previous mortgage, you haven't missed mortgage payments. Well, in this country, because of the history I described before, 70% of all white households own their own homes. Only 40% of Black households own their own homes. When somebody is going for the first time to buy a home, or not for the first time, somebody's going to buy a home and seeking a mortgage, a white applicant is much more likely than a Black applicant to have had a previous mortgage. The credit scoring agencies, the credit agencies, reporting agencies have a record of who has paid their mortgages on time. The banks, there are only a finite number of banks, that a small finite number of banks and mortgage companies that issue mortgages. They can transmit the data on their borrowers' payment records easily, electronically, without much effort. If you have owned a previous home and you've paid your mortgage on time, you get a good credit score and can get a low rate and eligibility for a mortgage for a new home. But if you haven't owned a previous home and you've been a renter all your life and paid your rent on time every single month for your entire adult history, you get no credit in your credit score for paying your rent on time. Mortgage payments are counted, not rental payments. It's a discriminatory system. And because African Americans are less likely to have a record of faithful mortgage payments, they find it more difficult to qualify for a mortgage. And if they do qualify for a mortgage, they get a higher rate because their credit score isn't as good. This is something that, again, can be remedied at a local level. Banks could be required by a community group, by pressure, public pressure at the local level. So could credit unions, to consider the rental records of applicants for their mortgages, to make inquiries to determine whether they are good credit risks. Of course, it's harder. While there is a small finite number of banks and major financial institutions that issue mortgages, there are hundreds of thousands of landlords. So there's no way to do it automatically the way they do for mortgages. But for an individual mortgage applicant, a bank or a credit union can look into their into their rental record payments and stop the discriminatory system. They won't do it unless there's public pressure from a local group. There are many other policies that we describe in Just Action that local groups can undertake. We generally divide them into two groups in the book. In order to redress segregation, we need to do two different kinds of policies. One is to improve the conditions in existing low-income, mostly African-American neighborhoods in this country. That would redress some of the consequences of segregation. The second group is policies that open up exclusive white neighborhoods to African-American residences. This is two aspects of the same policy, two sides of the same coin. We need to do both if we're going to redress segregation. I'll give you one final example before I close. In 2019, and this is on the web, you can find it easily, a newspaper called Long Island Newsday. It's the major newspaper on Long Island in New York, conducted what we call paired testing of real estate agents. What paired testing is sending two home buyers to a real estate agent, one black, one white, sending them at closely related times, but not the same time, a couple of days apart, perhaps. These are actors or volunteers who are pretend buyers. The whites and the blacks come with identical financial records, identical ability to afford a home, identical interests, identical professional backgrounds. Long Island Newsday went so far as to go to Nordstrom's, and an editor went to Nordstrom's and bought identical handbags for the black and white testers. What they found was, in New York and in most places in this country, you're permitted to do this. The testers wore hidden body cameras, buttonhole body cameras, to record their interactions with the real estate agents. And what Long Island Newsday reported was in 50% of the interactions between black applicants for homes, customers to real estate agents, and the agents themselves, in 50% of those interactions, they received discriminatory treatment, shown different homes than a white homeowner with the same qualifications was shown homes in different neighborhoods, given different information about the neighborhoods they were interested in. 50% they received discriminatory treatment. Now, a home buyer who goes to a realtor and seeks information about a home has no idea that he or she was discriminated against. They don't know that another homeowner who was white received different and better information about homes that he or she could buy. So the only way to identify this is with a paired testing program like Long Island Newsday conducted. The result is that the real estate industry continues to reinforce segregation. There's no reason to think that 50% of the realtors on Long Island, New York, are discriminating in 50% of them in interactions with black home seekers. That it's not going on in every community in the country, yours and every other one. This is a subject of action by the part of local civil rights groups to reform the real estate industry. You can only do it with a paired testing program. It doesn't have to be done by a local newspaper. There are fair housing centers in every community of the country, every large community in the country, that have the capacity to do paired testing. They don't have the funds to do it. They have small grants from the federal government, but the testing is expensive, even if the volunteers don't cost anything. And unless they have the funds to support this kind of program, they're not going to identify the realtors who are discriminating. And if they're identified, to pursue legal action against them to end this discrimination. This is another thing that's purely in the control of local community groups. It's not a federal issue. Happens, though, in every community and should be redressed. Well, there are many other policies that we describe in Just Action that local groups can undertake, that you can undertake as citizens in your own communities to begin the process of redressing segregation. I hope you'll take a look at some of these suggestions that we make in the book, get together with others in your communities, other citizens in your communities who are anxious to do something about this outrageous system of apartheid that we have, and be motivated to move our country forward in a more equal and less discriminatory fashion. But with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I've told you that you're the organizer of this event, that I'd be glad to answer questions by email if you have any. And I do hope that I've inspired you a little bit to take action with this book, Just Action. Thank you very much.